I don't really think about Africa, to tell you the truth. I guess I think much more about particular places within Africa, which is a very varied and complex place. And I don't know if any of you saw recently, The Economist had a kind of great graphic that got tweeted and bandied about a fair amount, where it showed you just how big Africa is, and they stuck the United States into one section, they stuck Russia into one section. I can't remember if China was in there too, but I think so, exactly how they distributed it. But you basically realized, this is a very enormous place, and it's very varied, and we tend to cover it poorly, fitfully, inattentively, in a fragmented and sporadic fashion, and usually when the news is only bad. I'm not against covering bad news. There's sort of sometimes this notion that covering bad news is offensive, but it's more that you don't cover the other stuff that's the shortfall. And there's an awful lot more to Africa than just its beauty and its woe and it's falling apart. But I do think that, broadly speaking, sub-Saharan Africa is still coming out of one of the most extraordinary and undercovered stories of human history, which is just total colonial brutalization. And the mess that left behind by a world more modernized and that had no patience whatsoever for the idea that it had just committed just an unbelievable atrocity on these societies, and thrown them together and torn them apart in all sorts of combinations, and given them a lot of notions that weren't really ready to stand on their own. So that in many ways, I think that what we've been seeing, is in a broad generalization over the last 50 years, is the kind of wars of post-colonialism. And what you're seeing in Africa right now is actually a lot of the broad trends are really on the up. You see the emergence of an African middle class that nobody really could have imagined in the past. You see a lot of bad wars, but frankly, I don't know where to look where you don't see a lot of bad wars. To me, the idea that Africa is seen as a sort of place of endless conflict, and the Middle East is still seen as a place you can go make a buck in the oil fields, or that this is like a more together, or potentially together, or modern part of the world, seems to me mysterious. And certainly during much of the last few decades, large parts of Latin America, South America were also plagued by many similar types of wars. So Africa, I think, gets a bum rap for being sort of uniquely conflict-ridden. It gets that because it's got a lot of conflict, but it's got a lot more than that. And it's taken a while to get on top of that, because when I say the sort of legacy of colonialism, I'm speaking about the fact that in a country like Congo, at the time of independence, there were, I can't remember what the exact number is, but it's like less than 24 college graduates. And it was not out of the inability of Congolese or the lack of interest on the part of Congolese. It was a Belgian program to make sure they weren't educated. There were people in other colonies that were. And then they just sort of are on their own with a country the size of Western Europe that never was a country before somebody in Europe drew a circle on a map of Africa and said, "This is mine," and then handed it off to Belgium, of which he had been king. So to me, working in Africa, and really particularly in Rwanda and in the Rwandan aftermath of the genocide in the last years, I go there because there's a huge amount that I learned from being there about what it means to make societies, about their fault lines, about our own misperceptions. It's extremely interesting place to get a perspective on how we look at things and how we feel sure of what we're doing, and critical of everybody else about almost everything that they're doing. We should have more coverage from there. I mean, it's from a reporting point of view, from a business point of view, much of the rest of the world has realized that there's enormous amounts of business to do in large parts of Africa, in many countries in Africa. America's been one of the last. America's relationship to Africa is basically one of importing Africans as chattel in the 19th century. And much of Europe has the slight advantage of having just colonized it, exporting themselves to Africa, but it actually means that as a result they have a stake in those stories. You know, grandpa lived in Congo, grandma was a young girl on a farm in Zimbabwe, what have you. The reporters and the press and so forth actually take this seriously and personally. America has never had a coherent relationship with Africa as anything but this place from which we imported slaves. And we then broke that relationship in the nature of the slave trade and its legacy in such a way that most African Americans don't necessarily feel any coherent connection to Africa in any form, in any modern sense, in any direct sense, unlike immigrant groups who have a heritage and a legacy that's a direct connection to that place. It's more abstracted. People say they're African Americans. They don't say, I'm a Nigerian American because of slavery. You know, they don't say, I'm from here or there, even if somebody once figured it out. And so I think that America's really got an enormous amount of catching up to do with what is, in fact, in many people's minds, the continent of this century. Many people think that, this is the African century, for better and for worse. For worse, meaning there's huge population explosion expected there. There's a vast urbanization. There's incredible technological development going on there. There's an immense potential. There's immense risks. There's a lot of land, a lot of food issues. There's all the stuff there. So go. Extraordinary bizarreness. I never got to the bottom of that phrase, but to him that was like, freaks of nature maybe is what he was trying to say. I don't know what he was trying to say, but to him it was like, they're that bad. And